On a freezing, rain-soaked night in Austin, Texas, a 76-year-old man stood at the bottom of his own staircase while his son screamed at him to get out of the house before dawn. His daughter-in-law stood beside the boy, arms crossed, smirking like they'd finally won. The old man didn't argue, he didn't beg. He picked up his battered suitcase and walked out into the storm. What those two had no idea about was that the very next morning he would wake up with $15 million in his bank account, and 3 weeks later they would be the ones on their knees begging him for their lives. If you believe a betrayal like that deserves consequences, hit the like button right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Stay with me, because how this quiet old man burned their whole world down is something you will not believe. But first, come with me to the garden. Good morning, I'm Nuya. Out here, the day starts before the sun is fully up. This morning, I'm heading down to pick tomatoes. The vines have been heavy and red all week, and the market won't wait. So I grab my basket, my little knife, my gloves, and I walk down to the field while the air is still cool. You pick the ripe ones gently, a small twist, and they come away in your hand, warm from the early sun. The trick is knowing which are ready and which need one more day. The garden teaches you patience whether you want to learn it or not. A full basket, and then it's off to the market, the way it is most mornings. And while I work, let me tell you a story, a true one, sent to me by a viewer that I haven't been able to shake. Out here in the dirt, there's one rule: the soil never breaks. You reap exactly what you sow. Plant kindness, and one day it feeds you. Plant cruelty, and the harvest always comes due. The people in the story forgot that rule. So let me take you all the way back to a cold, rainy Tuesday night in Texas and an old man named Victor. It was 11:30 at night on a miserable Tuesday, and the cold rain was lashing hard against the tall windows of a 2-story house in Austin, Texas. It was a beautiful home, a home that an old man named Victor Caldwell had bought with his own sweat, his own blood, and 1,000 nights of missing sleep. But on this night, the only sound louder than the rolling thunder outside was the sound of his own son, Derek, screaming at the top of his lungs. A heavy, sickening thud echoed down the long hallway. Victor's old leather suitcase, the same one he had carried across countless state lines through decades of hauling freight, came tumbling down the hardwood stairs. It hit the bottom step with a sharp crack and burst open, spilling his few belongings across the polished floor. Victor stood at the foot of the staircase, frozen, staring up at the boy he had raised with everything he had. Derek was 42 years old, wrapped in an expensive silk robe that had ultimately been paid for by his father's labor, and he was behaving like a cruel king casting out a worthless peasant. "Get out of this house," Derek roared, his face flushed deep red with raw, unfiltered anger. "Get your trash, pack your things, and be gone before dawn. Natalie can't stand having you here for one more second. We're done dealing with you." Victor's eyes drifted past his son. Natalie, Derek's 35-year-old wife, was leaning casually against the wooden railing. She didn't say a word, but her whole posture told him everything he needed to know. Arms crossed tight, manicured nails tapping against her sleeve, and a smug, deeply satisfied smirk curling out through the tinted window. The glowing streetlights blurred past in long smears of gold against the black, wet night. A normal man in Victor's fragile position would have been weeping uncontrollably. A normal father, freshly discarded by his own flesh and blood, would have been paralyzed by the crushing, suffocating heartbreak of it. And a small part of Victor did mourn, not the man on the stairs, but the innocent little boy Derek had been decades ago. The boy who used to press his nose to the cold window glass, waiting for his father's truck, but that brief flicker of grief was already being swallowed whole by something colder and far more useful. A profound, chilling sense of absolute clarity. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress for his family. He had endured grueling, body-breaking hours so that the people he loved would never know the bitter, humiliating taste of poverty. He had shielded his only son from every harsh edge of the real world, and in doing exactly that, he realized he had accidentally raised a fragile, entitled coward, a man who believed he could throw his own father away like a bag of garbage the moment he became inconvenient. The heavy silence in the car was broken by a sharp, persistent buzzing in Victor's damp coat pocket. He pulled the phone out slowly. The bright screen lit up the dark cabin, carving deep shadows into the weathered lines of his face. It was a secure message from his personal attorney, Mitchell Crawford. Mitchell was not just a lawyer. He was a brilliant tactician, a ruthless shark in a tailored suit, the one man Victor had trusted completely for the last 20 years.
He opened it. The words were short, but they carried the weight of a tectonic shift. The ink is dry, Victor. 15 million from the corporate buyout of your transport empire has officially cleared. The funds are now locked inside your irrevocable trust.
He read it a second time, letting the sheer size of it settle over him. $15 million. For the past 6 months, Victor had been quietly negotiating the sale of his commercial logistics company, a fleet of heavy trucks, a string of warehouses, all of it. Derek and his greedy wife had been certain that business was a dying dinosaur, an obsolete relic, barely scraping together enough profit to cover his small Social Security checks. They had no idea that a massive multinational conglomerate had been trying for years to buy his shipping routes and his prime commercial land. He had kept those negotiations completely classified. He had wanted to secure the wealth, lock it in a trust no creditor could ever touch, and quietly leave it all to Derek when the time was right. But life has a funny way of revealing exactly who people are right at the moment you most need to see it. He leaned forward and tapped the driver gently on the shoulder. "Change of plans," he said, his voice steady, with none of the broken tremor Derek had been so sure he'd hear. "Take me to the Four Seasons downtown." The driver nodded and merged smoothly onto the highway. 20 minutes later, the sleek black car rolled under the grand, brightly lit entrance of the hotel. The rain was still falling in violent sheets, but a valet rushed out at once with an enormous umbrella, shielding the old man as he stepped out. Victor walked through the heavy glass doors into a lobby of gold accents and crystal chandeliers. He knew the picture he made was almost comical, a 76-year-old man soaked to the bone in a faded flannel shirt and scuffed work boots, dragging a broken suitcase held together by little more than stubbornness. The night manager behind the polished marble desk blinked in open surprise, his trained eyes struggling to process the contradiction walking toward him. But Victor did not shuffle. He did not lower his gaze. He moved with the heavy, unhurried posture of a man who owned the very ground beneath his feet. He drew a sleek black metal card from his wallet and slid it across the cool marble. "I need your best available suite," he told the manager, "and I'd like the kitchen to send up a bone-in ribeye, cooked medium rare, to the room right away." The manager looked down at the name engraved on the card, and his entire demeanor changed in an instant. Within minutes, Victor was being escorted up to the penthouse level. The suite was a masterpiece of glass and stone, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a breathtaking view of the storm raging over the glowing Austin skyline. The contrast was almost poetic. Somewhere out there in the dark, wet suburbs, his son and that toxic woman were probably celebrating their supposed victory, pouring cheap grocery store wine and laughing at his expense. And up here, Victor was breathing the cool, clean air of total freedom. He peeled off his soaked clothes, stood under a long, scalding shower until the last trace of their betrayal had washed off his skin, and wrapped himself in a thick cotton robe. By the time he stepped back into the living area, a silver-domed room service cart had arrived. The rich smell of charred steak, roasted garlic, and seasoned potatoes filled the quiet suite. He poured himself a generous glass of aged single malt scotch from the bar, sat down at the broad oak table, and began to eat. It was 1 a.m. The steak was perfect, so tender it nearly melted, and the deep, complex burn of the scotch warmed his chest all the way down. He chewed slowly, deliberately, savoring every bite, letting the enormous silence of the suite wrap around his mind. He was not a helpless victim crying for pity in the dark. He was not a confused old man cast out into the cold. He was a patient predator, lying still in the tall grass. He had built a $15 million empire from absolutely nothing, surviving brutal market crashes, ruthless competitors, and crippling labor strikes. Did Derek honestly believe he would simply roll over and die because the boy had raised his voice in a living room? Men far smarter and far more ruthless than his son had tried to break Victor over the decades. Competitors had tried to bury him with lawyers. Banks had tried to choke him on bad terms. The market itself had tried twice to wipe him out completely. And every single time Victor had walked out of the wreckage still standing, quieter and harder than before. He had buried a wife he adored, and he had kept going. He had carried this family on his back for 50 years, and he had kept going. A boy in a silk robe and the woman whispering in his ear were not going to be the thing that finally finished him. If anything, they had just woken something up. As he cut another piece of steak, his sharp old mind began connecting the hidden dots of the evening. The unnatural urgency in their voices, the frantic, panicked way they'd shoved him out into the night without warning or discussion. They were hiding something enormous. They were in the middle of some desperate illegal financial maneuver, and his presence in that house had become an obstacle they needed to remove immediately. As he took a slow sip of scotch, watching lightning tear across the Texas sky, they believed they'd outsmarted a tired old man. In truth, they had just triggered a chain reaction that would dismantle their entire lives. He picked up his phone, typed a short reply to Mitchell, and hit send. The trap was set. Now he only had to sit back, watch the hidden cameras, and wait for them to hang themselves. The morning sun poured through the penthouse windows, throwing long shadows across the hardwood. Victor stood near the glass with a cup of black coffee, looking out over Austin. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving behind a brilliant, endless blue. It was a brand new day, and for the first time in 40 years, there were no logistics meetings, no freight negotiations waiting for him. He was a free man with $15 million in the bank and perfect clarity in his head, but he was in no mood to relax into retirement. The wound was still fresh, and his mind was fixed on one thing, understanding the exact machinery of their treachery. He walked to the heavy mahogany desk in the corner, sat down, and opened his laptop. 5 years earlier, when Derek and Natalie first moved into the house, the neighborhood had suffered a string of small burglaries. Derek, always anxious, never willing to do any physical labor himself, had begged his father to secure the property. So Victor had spent an entire weekend crawling through the hot attic, wiring a high-definition camera system into the house. He'd hidden discreet lenses in the hallway, the living room, the kitchen, the garage. When the grueling work was done, he handed Derek the master tablet and the administrator login. Predictably, his son lost the password within 3 months and never bothered to reset it. He simply let the system run silently in the background and forgot it existed. But Victor never forgot. He had built that network, and his master override code was still active. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. A small part of him dreaded what he was about to see. But the businessman in him knew the truth. Information is the ultimate weapon. He typed in the old password and pressed enter. The screen buffered for a second, then split into 4 crystal clear feeds. The timestamp in the corner read 8:45 in the morning. Victor leaned closer, scanning the familiar rooms of the house he had paid for. Derek and Natalie were pacing nervously around the granite kitchen island. They did not look like a couple who had just reclaimed their privacy. They looked like cornered animals. Derek was biting his fingernails, a childhood habit he only fell back into when he was in serious trouble. Natalie was scrubbing a spotless countertop again and again, her face pale and drawn, the smug little smirk from the night before completely gone. They were waiting for someone. And suddenly the urgency of the midnight eviction made perfect sense. They hadn't thrown him out because Natalie was tired of him. They'd thrown him out because they needed the house empty for a specific visitor. At exactly 9 o'clock, the brass doorbell echoed through the audio feed. Derek physically jumped, smoothed down his expensive shirt, and rushed for the door. Natalie followed close behind, plastering a painfully fake smile onto her face. Victor watched as his son pulled the heavy door open and a man stepped into the foyer, dragging a wave of sleazy arrogance in with him. He was not a bank manager. He was not a real estate agent. He wore a loud pinstripe suit, thick gold rings, and hair slicked back with cheap grease. Victor recognized the type instantly. In his early years building the company, he'd run into plenty of men exactly like him, circling desperate businesses like sharks. The man's name was Vaughn. He was a hard money lender, a loan shark in a shiny suit, a predator who fed on people too desperate to be approved by an honest bank. Vaughn didn't bother shaking Derek's trembling hand. He walked straight past him, his sharp eyes immediately appraising the crown molding and the custom hardwood floors. He carried a leather clipboard, scratching out aggressive notes as he moved through a rapid, invasive survey of the property. Derek hovered around him, sweating, while Natalie tried to offer the man an espresso he completely ignored. Vaughn strode into the center of the living room, the exact spot where Derek had hurled the suitcase 9 hours earlier, tapped his shoe against the floorboards, and asked a blunt question about the structural integrity of the foundation. Victor's blood ran cold as the whole horrifying picture snapped together. Derek and Natalie weren't just trying to get rid of him. They were trying to leverage the house to secure a massive loan from the black market. They needed him gone because his name was still legally tied to documents from the original purchase of the property, and a supposedly senile father wandering around during a shady appraisal would have wrecked the entire illegal facade. They were diving headfirst into a dangerous financial underworld, risking everything he had ever given them to chase whatever scheme Natalie had cooked up. Victor watched Vaughn tap his pen against the wall, dictating terms he knew carried a brutal, life-ruining interest rate. And Derek nodded along like an obedient, terrified dog, completely unaware of the noose tightening around his own neck. Victor sat back and took a slow sip of his coffee. The sting of the betrayal was gone now, replaced by a cold, calculating anticipation. They had thrown him into the rain, and in doing so they had handed him the perfect weapon for their own destruction. The quiet of the penthouse was broken by the ringing of his phone on the desk. Victor pulled his eyes from the live feed, where Vaughn was still measuring his former living room, and glanced at the screen. His son's name was glowing on it. A bitter chuckle escaped him. It hadn't been 12 hours since the boy threw his luggage down the stairs and locked him out in a freezing downpour, and here he was, calling in the middle of his own shady appraisal.
Victor let it ring 4 times, letting him sweat before swiping to answer. He said nothing. He simply breathed into the receiver and waited. "Dad? Is that you?" The voice was nothing like the raging tyrant of the night before. It was soft, dripping with manufactured guilt, the voice of a frightened boy who'd broken a window. "Listen, I am so sorry about last night. I completely lost my temper. I crossed a line. It was unforgivable." Victor stayed silent, letting the weight of his absence press down on his son.
Things have just been so tense lately, Derek went on, his tone sliding into a pathetic whine. Work has been a nightmare, and Natalie has terrible anxiety, and we were both just projecting all of it onto you. You know I love you, right? You're my father. I never wanted to kick you out.
I just panicked. It was a mistake.
On the screen, Victor watched Derek pacing the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Vaughn was still occupied. It was a masterful performance of pure deceit. I'm listening, Victor finally said, keeping his voice raspy and deliberately weak, the exhausted, broken old man Derek expected to hear. He heard his son exhale in relief. Victor knew exactly what was coming. A predator like Derek never apologizes unless he needs to extract something. Well, since we're clearing the air, Derek said, working hard to sound casual, I wanted to talk to you about something. I was looking over our finances this morning and we've got a very minor cash flow issue. Just a temporary bottleneck, really. Nothing serious. He paused, waiting for the bait to be taken. Victor gave him nothing. Derek cleared his throat and pressed on. The thing is, Dad, I know you've got that old retirement fund sitting around, the one with about $100,000 in it. If you could just lend that to us for a few months, it would really help us smooth things over. And honestly, if you help us out, Natalie and I agreed you can come back home. We'll clear out the basement for you. You'll have your own private space down there, away from the main floor. It'd be a win for everyone. The sheer audacity of it nearly took Victor's breath away. His son was offering him the grand privilege of living like a rat in the damp, unfinished basement of the house Victor himself had bought. And all it would cost was his entire life savings. The boy was standing in a room with a black market loan shark preparing to leverage millions, and he was still greedy enough to try to squeeze the last few pennies from his father's pockets. Victor's blood boiled beneath the surface, but he kept his breathing slow. He needed to keep Derek right where he was. He needed to hand him a false sense of security while he gathered more. Derek, I don't know, he said, letting his voice tremble as if he were overwhelmed and heartbroken. That money is all I have left in the world. It's my only safety net. I'm sitting in a cheap diner right now, drinking bitter coffee, trying to figure out where I'm even going to sleep tonight. I can't just transfer my whole retirement fund over the phone without talking to a bank. My head is scrambled from being out in the rain all night. I need some time to think. On the feed, Derek pinched the bridge of his nose, his fake patience wearing thin, but he forced the loving son routine back on. Okay, Dad, okay. Take a day to think about it. Just please don't do anything drastic. We're family and we really need to stick together through these little bumps. Call me tomorrow morning, alright? We need that money soon. Victor promised he would think it over and ended the call. He set the phone down on the desk and let out a long, hard breath. His son believed he had Victor backed into a corner with no idea he was standing on a trapdoor Victor had just finished building. The minor cash flow issue was a desperate lie to cover the $2 million loan he was negotiating at that very moment. He was frantically trying to drain his father's final accounts before discarding him for good. Victor picked up the phone again and dialed Mitchell's private line. It was time to find out exactly why his daughter-in-law needed $2 million from the criminal underworld. He set the phone back down, leaving Mitchell to deploy his investigators, and turned his attention back to the laptop. The live feed from the kitchen was still streaming. The tension in that room was thick enough to cut with a blade. Vaughn had finally finished his invasive tour. He dragged one of the expensive leather bar stools loudly across the pristine floor, sat down at the granite island, tossed his clipboard onto the counter, leaned back, and crossed his arms. Derek and Natalie stood rigidly on the other side, looking like terrified children waiting to be scolded. Derek swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. Natalie kept her hands clasped tight. Vaughn didn't bother with pleasantries. He stared straight at Derek with cold, dead eyes and asked exactly how much liquid cash they were looking to secure by the end of the week. Derek straightened, puffing out his chest in a pathetic show of confidence, and stated his number. $2 million, he said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the word. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Vaughn simply stared, his face blank. And then a harsh, mocking laugh burst out of him, loud enough to make Natalie flinch. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the granite, and shook his head in disbelief. He told Derek he must be living in a fantasy world. He jabbed a finger around the room and said bluntly that the entire house, even in this inflated market, would barely appraise for $800,000 on a fast cash sale. He broke down the brutal math. Even stripped to the bone, the collateral came nowhere near what a loan of that size required, especially at the kind of interest he charged. A wave of pure panic washed over Natalie's pale face. She looked at her husband, her eyes wide, silently begging him to fix the crumbling situation. But Derek for once looked completely unfazed. He actually smiled, a sickening, arrogant smirk that turned Victor's stomach. He told Vaughn to calm down and wait a minute. He reached into the leather briefcase at his feet and pulled out a thick manila folder, slapping it down on the granite with a dramatic smack, then sliding it across the counter toward the loan shark. "This house is just the appetizer," Derek declared, his voice swollen with unearned pride. "I've got something much bigger to offer you." Vaughn looked skeptical, but his greed got the better of him. He flipped the folder open and began scanning the documents inside. And through the camera mounted above the island, Victor could clearly see the distinctive letterhead of his own commercial transport business. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Derek was offering up the crown jewel of Victor's entire life, the 5-acre commercial transport warehouse just off the main industrial highway, a massive, highly coveted piece of prime real estate Victor had bought 30 years ago when the whole area was nothing but empty dirt. Now it was worth millions. It was the physical, beating heart of his logistics operation, the work of a lifetime. Vaughn raised his eyebrows, genuinely impressed, tracing a thick finger down the valuation and the prime industrial zoning. But Vaughn was a seasoned criminal, not a fool. He looked up and narrowed his eyes. He pointed out the glaring problem. The name on the official deed was Victor Caldwell, not Derek Caldwell. He asked flatly exactly how Derek planned to leverage a multi-million-dollar commercial property that he did not legally own. And that was the moment Victor's son crossed a line from which there was no return. Derek leaned over the counter and lowered his voice into a conspiratorial whisper, as if sharing a brilliant secret. He looked Vaughn dead in the eye and delivered the ultimate betrayal with chilling ease. "My father is a very sick, confused old man," Derek lied, his face a smooth mask. "His mind is completely gone. We actually had to move him into a secure assisted living facility just last night for his own safety." Beside him, Natalie nodded along, playing the exhausted, long-suffering daughter-in-law to perfection. Derek reached back into the folder and pulled out a separate set of legal papers. Because of his severe mental decline, he went on smoothly. "My father signed full power of attorney over to me years ago. I have total legal control over his estate and his finances. I can leverage that warehouse without his knowledge or his consent." Victor sat frozen in his chair, staring at the screen in pure disbelief. The scale of the betrayal was staggering. His son was actively trying to steal his entire legacy using an outdated, completely invalid hospital document from 10 years ago. And it was not the theft that cut the deepest, it was the ease of the lie. The way Derek said the words, "his mind is completely gone," without a flicker of hesitation, without a single muscle of his face betraying any shame. To strip a loan shark of suspicion, his son had been willing to erase him entirely, to declare him senile, helpless, already as good as buried. In that one smooth, practiced sentence, Derek had told the world that his father was no longer a person at all, just an obstacle, just a signature to be forged. Derek was no longer just an ungrateful child, he was an active, dangerous enemy, and he was going to pay for this. Victor closed the laptop with a soft final click, cutting the feed. The image was gone from the screen, but the sight of his own son casually diagnosing him with dementia to a loan shark burned bright in his mind. The luxury of the suite suddenly felt suffocating. He dressed quickly, choosing a sharp, tailored suit he hadn't worn since his final board meeting, and took the private elevator down to the lobby. His destination was a discreet, exclusive cigar lounge in the heart of downtown, the kind of place where the wealthy and powerful handled their most sensitive business away from prying eyes. The heavy oak doors opened onto a dim room of rich mahogany paneling and the thick aroma of aged tobacco and bourbon. Victor walked past the low murmur of politicians and executives to a leather booth tucked into the deepest corner, where Mitchell Crawford was already waiting, sharp as ever, drawing slowly on a dark Maduro cigar, a heavy briefcase resting on the table. Victor slid into the booth and ordered a neat scotch. Mitchell offered no warm greeting. He knew his client too well, and he could see the cold fury radiating off him. Victor recounted everything he'd just witnessed, how Derek had confidently presented a decade-old medical power of attorney to a black market loan shark to leverage the 5-acre warehouse. Mitchell simply nodded, tapping ash into the crystal tray. With a predator's calm, he assured Victor the old document was completely worthless. The warehouse had been legally transferred to the multinational logistics corporation 3 days ago as part of the $15 million buyout. Derek was trying to pawn a phantom asset. That trap was already set in stone, but the core mystery remained. Why? Victor asked, leaning over the polished table. Does a 42-year-old vice president with a comfortable 6-figure salary suddenly need $2 million in untraceable high-interest cash? It makes no sense. Even with their ridiculous spending, the organic groceries, the designer clothes, Derek earns more than enough to float that lifestyle. What kind of catastrophic hole did he dig for himself in such a short time? Mitchell smiled grimly and reached for the brass latches of his briefcase. He popped them open and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized dossier, the work of his elite team of investigators, and slid it across the table. My people have been tearing through his financial footprint all morning, Mitchell said, his voice low and steady. Bank statements, credit history, recent wire transfers, and you're right, Victor. Derek isn't the one burning through the cash. Your son is arrogant, entitled, and weak, but he's not a degenerate gambler and he's not a secret addict. The bleed isn't coming from him. Victor opened the folder, his eyes moving down the dense rows of highlighted transactions and forensic summaries. The picture they painted was clear and deeply disturbing. Over the last 18 months, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been systematically drained from Derek's checking and savings accounts, funneled again and again into a newly registered limited liability company. He looked up, waiting. The money is for Natalie, Mitchell said flatly, taking another slow draw on his cigar. Your lovely daughter-in-law has been quietly siphoning off every spare dollar in that house to fund what she calls a boutique fitness startup. According to the filings, it's an exclusive high-end Pilates and wellness center. She convinced Derek she was going to be the next big female entrepreneur in Austin, promised him they'd double their net worth within a year if he'd just provide the seed capital. Victor stared at the documents, caught between disgust and a dark, bitter amusement. Natalie had always carried herself with such unearned superiority, acting like a brilliant business mind forced to tolerate his blue-collar background. And here was the truth laid bare, an opportunistic parasite quietly bleeding his son dry to feed her own delusional vanity project. Derek, desperate to keep his demanding wife happy, had handed over the keys to his own ruin. but the numbers still didn't fully line up. Victor tapped his finger against the highlighted total of the siphoned funds. This shows she's already drained roughly $400,000 from his legitimate accounts, he noted, studying the spread of the data. That explains why his savings are wiped out. But it doesn't explain the raw panic I watched this morning. It doesn't explain why she suddenly needs an immediate $2 million from a dangerous man like Vaughn. A little fitness studio doesn't require that kind of overnight capital. Mitchell leaned across the table, his eyes locking onto Victor's with an intensity that sent a chill down the old man's spine. That's because the fitness studio is a complete lie, Victor, he said softly. Turn to the last page of the dossier. You need to see exactly where that money is really going. Victor reached out and pinched the thick edge of the heavy paper, flipping to the very last page of the dossier. He braced himself for what he expected to find. Some complicated offshore banking scheme, maybe a hidden gambling debt. Instead, he found himself staring at a set of glossy surveillance photographs. They were pictures of his daughter-in-law, Natalie. But she was not wearing her usual conservative business attire, and she was most certainly not sitting in a corporate boardroom negotiating a lease for a wellness center. She was lounging on the pristine white deck of a luxury catamaran, in a tiny designer swimsuit, laughing with her head thrown back and a cocktail in her hand. And wrapped tightly around her waist were the muscular, tanned arms of a man who was very clearly not her husband. Victor stared at the arrogant young face. The man looked like he barely had to shave. Mitchell leaned back into the leather booth, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. His name is Lance, he said, his voice thick with disgust. He's 20, a freelance personal fitness instructor, no business background, no college degree, and no actual studio space. What he does have is an active social media presence and an extremely close relationship with your daughter-in-law. Victor kept his eyes fixed on the photographs. There were dozens of them. The two of them walking hand in hand out of expensive boutique hotels in the middle of the afternoon. The two of them sharing intimate dinners at five-star restaurants on the far side of town, while Derek was working late at the corporate office. For a long moment, Victor simply sat there, staring at the laughing face in the photograph. He had braced himself for something ugly, embezzlement, a gambling debt, some greedy little scheme. But this was something different. This was rot, all the way down to the root. His son had thrown his own father out into the rain, had stood at the top of those stairs and called him a useless drain, all to protect a marriage that had already been hollowed out from the inside. The woman Derek was so terrified of losing, the woman he had chosen over his own blood, was lying in the arms of a boy half his age on a boat his father's money had quietly paid for. There was a bitter, almost dizzying symmetry to it, and somewhere beneath the disgust, Victor felt the last thread of his hesitation finally snap. He had spent the drive from the house wondering, in the back of his mind, whether some part of this was still salvageable, whether the boy he raised was still in there somewhere. These photographs were his answer. There was nothing left to save. He turned to the next page, which laid out a detailed breakdown of the limited liability company Natalie had so aggressively pitched to his son. Mitchell pointed the glowing cherry of his cigar at the spreadsheet. The boutique fitness startup does not actually exist, Victor. It's a classic shell company. An empty corporate shell registered to a virtual mailbox in a strip mall. There's no commercial lease, no exercise equipment, no payroll, no business plan. Every single dollar Derek transferred into that corporate account was immediately funneled out and deposited straight into Lance's private checking account.
Victor traced his finger down the long column of stolen money. It was sickening. Derek had believed he was providing crucial seed capital to empower his ambitious wife. He'd proudly imagined himself an angel investor, backing a brilliant local entrepreneur. In reality, he had been blindly financing a passionate affair. His son was literally paying for the tropical vacations, the imported sports cars, and the luxury watches of the man who was sleeping with his wife.
What struck Victor hardest was the sheer performance of it all. For years, Natalie had carried herself through his house like minor royalty slumming among the peasants. She had wrinkled her nose at his calloused hands, made little comments about his blue-collar manners, sighed dramatically whenever he told an old story about his years on the road. She had positioned herself as the brilliant, sophisticated businesswoman trapped in a family beneath her. And the entire time, that grand self-image had been a costume, a careful disguise stretched over an ordinary thief. She was not a visionary entrepreneur. She was a woman who had found a soft, insecure man with money and a generous father and had simply opened a vein and let it bleed. The wellness empire, the talk of doubling their net worth, the marketing materials, all of it was theater, staged for an audience of exactly one gullible husband. Victor had met 100 people like her in his decades of business, people who confused taking from others with building something of their own. They always mistook the patience of the people around them for stupidity, and they were always eventually surprised. The sheer scale of Derek's stupidity was almost hard to comprehend. How could a man in his 40s be so completely oblivious to the massive deception happening directly under his own roof? How could he fail to notice the missing hundreds of thousands of dollars, or the obvious lies about a fitness studio that did not exist? Because he's desperate, Mitchell answered, reading the silent question on Victor's face. Derek is deeply insecure. He spent his entire marriage terrified that Natalie was going to leave him for someone younger, someone more exciting. So when she finally came to him with a grand vision, flattering his ego, begging for his support, he handed over his bank accounts without asking a single logical question. He wanted to be her hero, and now she's bled his legitimate accounts completely dry. Victor let the words settle, and a strange hollow recognition moved through him. He had watched this exact weakness take shape in Derek decades ago, the desperate, bottomless need to be admired, to be told he was enough. As a boy, Derek had always performed for approval, always measured his own worth in the eyes of whoever happened to be in the room. Victor had told himself it was just a phase, that the boy would grow out of it once he found his footing in the world. Instead, he had grown into a man who would set fire to everything he had, just to keep one person from walking away. Natalie had simply read that weakness the way a card shark reads a nervous player, and she had played it to the very last chip. In a strange way, Victor thought, the two of them deserved each other, the parasite and the host who kept inviting her back to the table. Which brings us to the 2 million, Victor murmured, the dark pieces of the puzzle finally sliding into place. He looked up, meeting Mitchell's sharp gaze. Natalie knows the well is dry, so she convinced Derek to take out a black market loan against his own home and against my commercial warehouse. She told him the fake business needed a massive, immediate injection of capital to lock down a prime commercial location, or the whole imaginary enterprise would collapse. And Derek, terrified of failing her, terrified of losing his precious wife, is eagerly willing to commit federal fraud and risk his own life to get her that money. Mitchell nodded slowly, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. Exactly. She's pushing him to leverage everything he has left and everything he can steal from you. And once that money hits the joint account, what do you think she's going to do with it? She's going to take it and run, Victor said, the cold reality settling in the center of his chest. She'll transfer that lump sum straight to Lance, pack her designer bags, and vanish before the ink on the loan documents even has a chance to dry. She'll leave Derek completely bankrupt, facing foreclosure, and owing $2 million to a violent loan shark who will not think twice about breaking his legs. The ruthlessness of her plan was genuinely staggering. She was not simply cheating on his son. She was carefully constructing a financial guillotine, positioning his neck on the chopping block, and preparing to drop the blade. A normal father might have felt an overwhelming urge to intervene, A normal father might have rushed straight back to that house, kicked down the door, and dragged his son away from the edge of the cliff, but Victor was done being the savior. He had spent 30 years protecting Derek from the consequences of his own foolish choices, and his reward had been getting thrown out into the freezing rain like a bag of garbage. He thought back over all of it, sitting there in the dim lounge with the dossier closed under his hand. Every time Derek had crashed a car, Victor had quietly paid for it. Every time the boy had failed a class, lost a job, talked his way into trouble, Victor had been there with an open checkbook and a soft landing. He had believed, the way every working father believes, that if he could just absorb enough of the blows himself, his son would never have to learn the world the hard way. And that had been the fatal error. He had not raised a man. He had raised a passenger, someone who had never once felt the full weight of his own decisions, because his father had always been underneath, holding it up. A boy who has never been allowed to fall does not learn gratitude. He learns that the floor will always be there no matter how hard he stomps on it. Well, Victor decided the floor was about to disappear. And for the first time, his son was going to feel exactly how far the drop really was. He closed the heavy dossier and pushed it back across the polished table. He picked up his glass of scotch and took a slow sip, letting the burn settle the racing thoughts in his mind. Do absolutely nothing, he instructed Mitchell, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. Let the loan shark approve the deal. Let Derek forge my signature. We're going to watch them burn. The heavy oak doors of the cigar lounge closed behind him, shutting out the scent of aged tobacco and the dark revelations of the afternoon. Victor took a slow walk back toward the penthouse, letting the cool evening air clear his lungs. The city of Austin was winding down, its bustling streets giving way to the quiet hum of night. But inside his mind, the gears were turning with relentless, mechanical precision. He walked slowly, in no hurry at all, his hands in the pockets of his tailored coat, and he found that the rage he might have expected to feel simply was not there. Rage was a young man's fuel, hot, loud, quickly spent. What Victor felt instead was something far more durable. It was the cold, patient focus he used to feel in the final hours of a difficult negotiation, when he could see the entire board laid out in front of him and every move his opponent might make. He had spent his whole life building things slowly, brick by brick, season by season, while flashier men chased quick fortunes and burned out. That patience was the only real weapon he had ever owned. And now his son and that woman, in their frantic greed, had set themselves up to be undone by the one quality they had always been too arrogant to respect. He did not need to lift a finger in anger. He only needed to be patient and to watch. By the time he returned to the suite, it was past midnight. The skyline was a glittering blanket of light beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He didn't bother turning on the interior light. He walked straight to the mahogany desk, sat down in the heavy leather chair, and opened his laptop. The screen lit the dark room with a pale, ghostly glow as he connected to the camera network in his former home. He fully expected to see the house dark, Derek and Natalie asleep in their expensive bed. Instead, the dining room feed showed a scene of frantic, nervous energy. The chandelier over the long table was turned up to its maximum brightness, casting a harsh light over the room. Scattered across the polished wood were dozens of loose papers, several legal binders, and an assortment of black ink pens. Derek was hunched over the table, his posture tense and rigid. His expensive dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves shoved up past his elbows, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead under the bright light. Natalie stood right behind him, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, clutching her phone in one hand, tapping the screen every few seconds to check for messages. Victor knew exactly who she was hoping to hear from: Lance, the young fitness instructor currently living large on his son's stolen money. But Derek was completely oblivious to his wife's betrayal. His entire focus was locked onto a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper in the center of the table. Victor zoomed in on the feed. It was the outdated medical power of attorney, the same useless piece of legal fiction Derek had flaunted to the loan shark that morning. The signature line at the very bottom was completely blank. Spread out around him was a stack of old birthday cards and canceled checks, all bearing Victor's authentic signature. Derek was gripping a pen with white knuckles, slowly and methodically practicing his father's handwriting on a separate sheet of scrap paper. He was committing federal forgery right there at the dining table. Victor watched in chilling silence as his son tried to replicate the sharp, deliberate loops of his name. Derek would trace a letter, curse under his breath, crumple the scrap, and start all over again. The tension in the room was thick and suffocating. Natalie let out a loud, theatrical sigh of frustration. She stopped pacing, slammed both hands down onto the back of his chair, and complained bitterly about how long the whole thing was taking. She whined that Vaughn was expecting the finalized paperwork by morning, and that if they didn't deliver the collateral, the $2 million loan would fall through completely. Her voice was sharp and cruel, completely empty of any affection for the man she was manipulating. Derek flinched at her tone, but he didn't argue back. He just wiped the sweat from his brow and hunched closer to the table. "Just relax, Natalie," he muttered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and exhausting concentration. "But I have to get the curve of the V exactly right, or the notary is going to flag it as a fake. This has to be perfect." Natalie rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. She told him to just hurry up and sign the damn paper, that no one was going to scrutinize the signature of a confused old man anyway. Derek paused, the pen hovering over the document. He looked up at his wife, and a dark, unsettling shadow passed over his face. He nodded slowly, fully embracing the twisted logic she was feeding him. "You're right," Derek said, his voice dropping into a cold, callous register Victor had never heard from him before. "It doesn't even matter. The old man is practically dead anyway. He's a ghost. We're just taking what's rightfully ours a few years early." Hearing those exact words fall from his own son's mouth was a profound physical blow. It was the final devastating confirmation that the boy he had raised was entirely gone. Derek did not just want his money. He had already buried his father in his mind. He had erased his humanity completely, just to justify his own unforgivable greed. For a moment, the old grief tried to rise up in Victor's chest. The same grief that had ambushed him in the car on that first rainy night. He let himself feel it just for a breath. He thought of the small boy who used to fall asleep in the cab of his truck on long summer hauls. The boy who had once drawn him a crayon picture of the two of them standing in front of the house, captioned in shaky letters with the words asterisk, "My dad built this." That boy had been real once. Victor was certain of it. But the man hunched over that dining table, carefully practicing a dead man's signature so he could rob him, was a stranger wearing his son's face. And a stranger, Victor reminded himself, owes you nothing, and you owe a stranger nothing in return. The grief receded. In its place was that same cold, steady clarity that had carried him through every disaster of his long life.
Victor sat perfectly still in the dark penthouse, watching the screen as Derek pressed the pen down onto the official document. His son held his breath and dragged the ink across the signature line, meticulously copying the exact slant and heavy pressure of Victor's handwriting. He finished the final letter and lifted the pen. Natalie immediately leaned over his shoulder, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. A slow, sinister smile spread across Derek's sweating face. He held the forged document up to the harsh chandelier light. admiring his own criminal handiwork. It was a flawless fake. Natalie laughed with delight, leaned down and kissed him on the cheek, praising his brilliance.
They were celebrating their absolute victory, completely unaware that Victor was capturing every single frame of their felony in crystal clear, high-definition video. He reached out and pressed save. The file locked itself safely onto his hard drive. They had just manufactured the exact rope he needed to hang them. The sun had barely begun to rise over the Austin skyline when a sharp knock echoed through the quiet penthouse. Victor had not slept a single minute. He was sitting exactly where he'd been all night, staring at the frozen frame of his son holding the forged document up to the dining room light. He stood, his joints stiff from the long vigil, and crossed the room to unlock the door. Mitchell Crawford stepped inside, carrying his familiar leather briefcase and 2 steaming cups of black coffee. He took one look at Victor's face and knew at once that something monumental had happened in the night. Victor silently led him to the mahogany desk and pressed play. Mitchell stood behind the chair, his eyes fixed on the screen as the footage rolled. He watched Derek frantically practice the signature. He listened to Natalie complain about the timeline. And he heard the devastating, callous moment when Derek declared his father practically dead. Mitchell let out a long, heavy breath, setting his coffee cup down with a sharp clink. As an experienced attorney, he had seen families tear each other apart over money more times than he could count, but the sheer brazenness of this forgery left even him momentarily speechless. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the back of Victor's chair, his legal mind shifting into high gear. "Victor, we have to move on this right now," Mitchell said, his voice dropping into a serious, urgent tone. "We have absolute proof of a major federal crime. If we take this footage to the police immediately, we can have a squad car dispatched to their house before Bond even arrives to finalize the paperwork. We can stop this whole transaction dead in its tracks. We need to protect the warehouse. If that loan shark officially registers a lien against your property, it will take me months of exhausting litigation to untangle the mess and clear your title. We cannot let Derek pledge your 5-acre logistics hub as collateral for a black market loan." Any sane man hearing that would have immediately agreed. He would have grabbed his coat and rushed to the nearest police precinct to save his life's work. But Victor was no longer playing defense. He slowly turned his leather chair to face Mitchell. A strange, unfamiliar sensation began to bubble up deep inside his chest. It started as a low, quiet rumble and quickly erupted into a loud, genuine laugh. It was the first time he had truly laughed in years. The sound echoed off the high ceiling of the penthouse, completely startling Mitchell, who took a half step back, his brow furrowing in confusion. He looked at Victor as if the shock of the betrayal had finally cracked his sanity.
But it was not madness, it was release. For 3 days, Victor had been carrying the full crushing weight of what his son had done. The eviction, the lies, the forged signature, the casual talk of him being as good as dead. He had held it all in with that terrible, steady calm, and somewhere in there the pressure had been quietly building. And now, watching his loyal old friend leap into action to save him with a perfectly sensible plan, the absurd, magnificent truth of the situation had finally broken loose. They were all rushing to protect a treasure that no longer needed protecting. The disaster Mitchell was scrambling to prevent was the very thing Victor most wanted to happen. The laugh was the sound of a man who has just realized that the trap his enemies built for him is in fact the trap he has been quietly building for them. Victor held up a hand, wiping a small tear of dark amusement from the corner of his eye, and motioned for his attorney to sit down.
"Mitchell," he said, his voice rich with a deep, satisfying calm, "you don't need to worry about the title to the warehouse, and we are certainly not calling the police to stop this loan. Let them sign the papers. Let Derek confidently hand that forged power of attorney directly over to Vaughn. Mitchell shook his head, utterly bewildered. Victor, you're not thinking clearly, he argued, his professional composure slipping. Vaughn is a dangerous, violent criminal. He is not some neighborhood bank manager who will simply apologize and walk away when he realizes the paperwork is fraudulent. If he sinks his hooks into your commercial property, he will physically occupy it. He'll send armed thugs to your loading docks. You cannot afford to let your crown jewel get tied up in a violent underworld dispute. It's your most valuable asset. Victor smiled warmly at his old friend, leaning back into the comfortable chair. That's where you are completely wrong, Mitchell, he replied smoothly. It is no longer my asset. Mitchell froze, his eyes widening as the implications slowly began to register in his sharp legal mind. Victor laced his fingers together, savoring the brilliance of the moment. He reminded Mitchell about the final intense stages of the $15 million buyout they had closed just 3 days ago. The multinational logistics corporation that had purchased his company had demanded full rights to the 5-acre transport warehouse as the central condition of the entire deal. That massive property was the literal crown jewel they were after. And 3 days ago, while Derek and Natalie were busy planning how to throw him out into the rain, Victor had legally transferred the official deed. The warehouse now belonged to a ruthless, multi-billion-dollar global conglomerate, protected by an army of aggressive corporate lawyers and a highly trained, heavily armed private security force. He watched the understanding bloom slowly across Mitchell's face, and he could not help the thin, cold smile that came with it. It was the timing that made the whole thing so perfect. The kind of timing no man could plan, only recognize when fate handed it to him. For 3 days, Derek had been walking around that house believing he held the keys to a multi-million-dollar property. For 3 days, he had been bragging to a loan shark, forging documents, draining his accounts, sleeping soundly under his father's old roof, all of it built on a foundation that had already crumbled into nothing the moment he was too arrogant to notice. He had been a king ruling over a kingdom that had already been sold out from under him, and he never even felt the ground shift. My son is currently trying to pledge a phantom asset, Victor explained, the cold logic of the trap settling perfectly over the room. He is promising a dangerous loan shark a piece of commercial real estate that I no longer own. If we stop the loan now, Derek gets arrested for attempted forgery, but he survives. He goes to a comfortable white-collar prison for a few months, and Natalie immediately files for divorce, playing the innocent, victimized wife. She walks away clean with her offshore money and her young lover, and my son becomes a sympathetic little story she tells at parties. I am not going to allow that to happen. He ordered Mitchell to stand down completely. We let the criminal transaction proceed without a single interruption. We let every domino fall in the exact order they themselves set them up. And when the exorbitant interest payment comes due and Vaughn tries to violently seize his collateral, he will hit a massive impenetrable wall of corporate security. And then he will turn his attention to the two people who actually took his money. Mitchell stared at him for a long moment, and then slowly the grim brilliance of it all dawned across his face. He nodded, understanding the full gravity of the plan. They built their own gallows, Victor said quietly, turning back to the glowing screen. Now we simply let them climb the steps. And so Mitchell, saying nothing more, quietly packed up his leather briefcase and left the old man to his patient, terrible vigil. The trap was no longer a question of if, it was only a question of when. And every hour that passed brought his son and that woman one step closer to the moment they had so eagerly set in motion themselves, the moment the rope would finally pull tight. Over the next 48 hours, Victor remained secluded inside his luxurious penthouse, quietly monitoring the digital breadcrumbs of his son's catastrophic mistake. Thanks to the forensic accounting software Mitchell's team had discreetly installed on Derek's compromised home network, he had a perfect, unrestricted, front row seat to the financial execution to come. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. A banking alert flashed across his laptop screen with a harsh red notification. The hard money loan had been officially approved. Vaughn, the sleazy predator in the pinstripe suit, had accepted the flawlessly forged power of attorney and the worthless collateral without asking a single further question. A massive wire transfer of exactly $2 million cleared the banking system and landed directly in Derek's joint checking account. Victor watched the numbers leap from a pathetic 0 to a seven-figure sum in a fraction of a second. Derek was sitting at his desk at the corporate office across town, likely sweating through his suit, completely unaware of what his loving wife was doing back at the house. Victor switched his screen to the live security feed. Natalie was seated at the granite kitchen island, the exact spot where they had negotiated with the loan shark. Her sleek silver laptop was open in front of her, her fingers flying across the keys. She did not look anxious or afraid. She looked absolutely exhilarated. A wide, predatory smile stretched across her beautiful face, her eyes gleaming with the dark thrill of the theft. Victor pulled up the mirror of her browser. She was logged into their joint banking portal, and she did not wait. She did not let the dust settle for even a single hour. Without 1 second of hesitation, without a flicker of remorse for her husband, Natalie initiated an international wire transfer. She carefully typed in the routing number for an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account belonging to Lance, her 25-year-old lover. Victor watched the cursor hover over the bright green confirm button. She typed in the amount with steady hands, $1,500,000. She clicked send. The screen buffered for an agonizing moment, then refreshed with a bold confirmation message. The transaction had bypassed the domestic hold and vanished forever into the international banking void. Natalie let out a sharp, joyful squeal. Clapping her hands together like a child on her birthday, she snatched up her phone and dialed Lance. Through the kitchen microphone, Victor heard her blow a loud kiss into the receiver, whispering excitedly that the payday had finally arrived, that she would be packing her bags soon. She had just stolen $1.5 million from a violent criminal using her own husband's forged signature as a disposable shield. A few hours later, the front door swung open and Derek walked in looking exhausted but immensely relieved, loosening his silk tie and dropping his briefcase onto the hardwood. Natalie greeted him with a passionate, entirely fake embrace and pressed a tall crystal glass of expensive champagne into his hand. Before he'd arrived, she had quietly adjusted the banking interface, hiding the offshore transfer and leaving only a visible balance of $500,000, which she smoothly explained as the initial working capital Vaughn had released for her business. Derek, blinded by relief and his desperate need to please her, did not question the glaring discrepancy. He simply assumed the rest was safely tucked away in a secondary escrow account. He took a long, greedy gulp of champagne and laughed, a loud, triumphant sound that shook his shoulders. "We did it, Natalie," he cheered, wrapping his arm around her waist. "We actually pulled it off. The business is fully funded, the house is safe, and we are going to be incredibly wealthy." Natalie smiled up at him, her dark eyes utterly empty of affection. "Let's celebrate properly," she purred, running a hand down his chest. "We deserve a reward for dealing with all this stress." They spent the next 2 hours burning through the remaining $500,000 with a reckless, sickening speed. Victor watched through the high-definition feed as they passed a tablet back and forth on the sofa. Derek logged onto a luxury European car dealership and placed a massive deposit on a custom-ordered black Porsche. Natalie browsed an exclusive jewelry boutique, ordering 2 diamond-encrusted Rolex watches and tossing tens of thousands of dollars in designer clothing into her cart. They were spending the loan shark's dirty money as though they'd just won the state lottery. Derek poured another round and raised his heavy glass toward the dark bay window, a cruel sneer twisting his familiar features. "To our brilliant future," he toasted, his voice echoing through the expensive house, "and a special toast to my pathetic, useless old father. I wonder which freezing homeless shelter the old man is sleeping in tonight. I hope he's enjoying his stale bread and his poverty while we sit right here building a real empire." Natalie laughed, a sharp, cold sound that perfectly matched his cruelty, and clinked her glass against his. Victor sat quietly, watching them celebrate their own doom. 3 weeks passed in a blur of extravagance. Victor remained in the comfort of his downtown penthouse, sipping his morning coffee while he watched his son and his wife act out their illusion of grandeur through the security cameras. They paraded around the house like royalty. Derek drove his new black Porsche to the office every single morning, the loud exhaust echoing through the quiet suburb. Natalie spent her afternoons hosting lavish catered lunches for her shallow friends, flashing her diamond Rolex and bragging about her brilliant new fitness empire. They had completely forgotten about him. They assumed he was rotting away in some forgotten alley, defeated. But while they drowned in their vanity, the calendar kept turning, carrying them closer and closer to the edge of the cliff they had so eagerly leapt from. Victor found a strange, quiet patience in those 3 weeks. Every morning he would brew his coffee, settle into his chair by the window, and open the feeds the way another man might open the morning paper. He watched his son polish that absurd black car in the driveway. He watched Natalie air kiss her shallow friends and lift her wrists so the diamonds would catch the light. You watched them toast their imaginary empire over dinners that cost more than he used to earn in a week hauling freight, and he felt no urgency at all because he understood something they did not. He had spent 40 years studying how things fail. A bridge does not collapse the moment it is overloaded. It groans, it holds, it looks perfectly fine right up until the instant it does not. These two were standing in the very center of a structure that was already failing, laughing, taking selfies, completely deaf to the sound of the supports beginning to crack beneath them. He did not need to push. Gravity was already doing the work. He only had to wait for the math to finish. A black market loan from a man like Vaughn is not a traditional mortgage. It does not come with the luxury of a 30-year repayment plan or a polite grace period. It is a financial guillotine. Interest accumulates with a ruthless, predatory speed designed to drown the borrower. And the first payment, a staggering $75,000, just to keep the principal from defaulting, was officially due on a Friday. That Friday morning began like any other for them, but the atmosphere in the house shifted quickly, from arrogant bliss to suffocating dread. Through the home office feed, Victor watched Derek sit down at his mahogany desk, still in his silk pajamas, holding a fresh cup of coffee. He opened his laptop and logged into the banking portal to make the transfer to Vaughn. Victor watched his son's face.
The transformation was beautiful. The smug, confident expression melted away in an instant, replaced by a pale, sickly mask of pure terror. Derek leaned closer to the screen, frantically clicking refresh, as if the bank had simply made a clerical error. But there was no error. The balance was terrifyingly low. In just 21 days, they had managed to burn through $500,000 of stolen money. They had paid cash for the sports car, bought tens of thousands in designer clothing, vintage wines and custom furniture, and dined at the most exclusive restaurants in the city every night, ordering the most expensive champagne on every menu.
Derek stared at the 2-digit number remaining in his checking account, his breathing turning shallow and rapid. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. The coffee cup trembled in his hand before he carefully set it down. He frantically opened a new tab and checked his personal credit cards, all maxed out. He checked his corporate expense account, already drained. The reality crashed down on him with the weight of a falling building. If he did not wire $75,000 to Vaughn by the end of the business day, the loan shark would declare the loan in default, begin seizing the collateral, and send his violent associates to the house to collect. Derek shoved his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood, and stumbled out of the office. He found Natalie on the living room sofa, mindlessly scrolling her phone while a daytime show murmured in the background. She looked completely relaxed, utterly unconcerned with the financial apocalypse bearing down on them. "Natalie, we have a massive problem," Derek stammered, his hands shaking as he held up his phone. "The account is completely drained. We spent everything. I just tried to schedule the first interest payment, and the transaction was declined for insufficient funds." Natalie didn't even look up. She flipped her hair over her shoulder and sighed, as if he told her they were out of organic milk. "Well, just move some money over from your savings account, Derek. I'm very busy finalizing the marketing materials for the studio launch. I don't have time to micromanage your banking errors." Derek dropped to his knees in front of her, physically blocking her view of the television. His face was a portrait of desperation. "Natalie, you are not listening to me," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "There is no savings account. We emptied it to fund your startup. Remember, there is nothing left. Vaughn expects $75,000 by 5 o'clock today. If we don't pay him, he's going to take the house. He's going to ruin us." Natalie finally looked up, her dark eyes flashing with calculated annoyance, and slowly set her phone down on the glass table. She knew exactly what was happening. She knew the $1.5 million was sitting safely in an offshore account, waiting for her and her young lover, but she had to maintain the fiction just a little longer. Derek grabbed her hands, his grip tight and desperate. "I need you to pull some capital from the fitness business," he begged. "I know the startup funds are tied up, but you have to reverse a transaction. If Vaughn defaults this loan, I'm going to federal prison for forging that document. Please, help me." Natalie looked down at her husband kneeling on the floor and felt nothing but contempt. She coldly pulled her hands away from his desperate grip and stood up. She told him to stop crying and promised she would call her business partner to arrange the transfer. Then she turned her back on him, walked upstairs to the master bedroom, and locked the heavy wooden door behind her. Through the hallway camera, Victor watched her shadow move beneath the door frame, and thanks to the surveillance Mitchell had placed on her phone, he could hear every word of her private call. Natalie tapped the speed dial for Lance, expecting his charming young voice. She was ready to tell him it was finally time to execute the last phase of their plan to pack their bags and board the first-class flight to the tropical paradise they'd been dreaming about. Instead, she was met with a harsh synthetic dial tone and a robotic voice stating that the number she had reached was no longer in service. She lowered the phone, frowning, and assumed he had simply let his battery die. She dialed again, pacing across the thick carpet. The same cold message answered. A small, sharp prick of genuine fear finally pierced her arrogant armor. She opened their text messages, scrolling through hundreds of romantic notes and heart emojis, and typed a rapid, demanding question, "Where are you?" She hit send. A bright red exclamation point appeared instantly beside the bubble. The message could not be delivered. He had blocked her on every platform. Her breathing accelerated. She rushed to her purse, grabbed her keys, flew out of the bedroom past Derek, who was still sitting in the living room with his head in his hands, and ran out to the driveway. She jumped into her new car and sped off. Victor picked up his own phone and called Mitchell. The investigators had placed a discreet tracker on Natalie's vehicle just days after she bought it. Mitchell shared his screen, and Victor watched a blinking red dot race across the digital map of Austin, running red lights and weaving through heavy traffic, heading straight for the commercial district on the east side, the exact location where she claimed her boutique studio was preparing for its grand opening. 20 minutes later, the dot came to a complete stop. Mitchell's investigator, who had been tailing her from a safe distance, patched a live video feed to Victor's computer. He watched Natalie throw her car into park and stumble out into the harsh sunlight. There was no sleek glass storefront, there were no yoga mats, no polished reception desk. There was only a dilapidated, overgrown parking lot, and behind a sagging chain-link fence, an empty brick warehouse with shattered, grime-coated windows. Nailed to the rusty front door was a faded sign that read, "Available for lease." Natalie walked slowly up to the dirty glass and cupped her hands around her face to peer inside. There was nothing in there but dust, cobwebs, and discarded trash. The magnificent business she had bragged about to all her wealthy friends was a complete fabrication. Lance had never signed a lease. He had never ordered a single piece of equipment. He had simply used a fake address to register a shell company and collect her stolen money. The brutal truth hit her with the force of a freight train. She stumbled backward, her hands trembling, and pulled out her phone one last time. She logged into the offshore account they had opened together in the Cayman Islands, desperate to see the $1.5 million sitting safely inside. The screen loaded slowly and then displayed a bold error message. The login credentials had been changed. She was permanently, completely locked out. Mitchell sent one final document over the secure connection. His investigators had tracked Lance's passport activity that morning. 4 hours earlier, the 25-year-old fitness instructor had boarded a private charter flight to a remote, non-extradition coastal town in Mexico. He was gone forever, and he had taken every single penny with him. He had played Natalie perfectly, turning her own greed and vanity into the very weapons that destroyed her. Through the investigator's camera, Victor watched Natalie collapse back into the driver's seat as a full-blown panic attack seized her. She gripped the steering wheel, gasping for air, her chest heaving with violent sobs, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark streaks. She was completely trapped. No studio, no lover, no millions waiting in the tropics. She was married to a man about to go to federal prison, and she was equally complicit in stealing $2 million from a ruthless loan shark who expected his payment by 5 o'clock. The walls of her magnificent deception had finally collapsed and crushed her. Victor sat in the dim light of his penthouse, a heavy crystal glass of single malt scotch resting comfortably in his hand. The smooth, peaty burn of the amber liquid was the perfect companion to the theater unfolding on his screen. It was late afternoon now, the shadows stretching long across the skyline, and the deadline was rapidly approaching. Through the living room feed, he watched Derek pacing frantically across the Persian rug he had purchased only 2 weeks ago, checking his luxury watch every 30 seconds. His face pale and slick with sweat. Then the front door swung open, and Natalie stumbled into the foyer. She looked like a ghost, her designer clothes rumpled, her makeup ruined by streaks of dried tears. She did not strut in with her usual arrogance. She moved with the heavy, uncoordinated steps of a woman walking to her own execution. Derek rushed toward her, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope. He grabbed her shoulders and shook her slightly, begging her to tell him she had transferred the $75,000 to save them. Natalie didn't answer right away. She just stared at him with hollow, dead eyes, and let her purse drop to the floor with a dull thud. Derek's voice rose into a sharp, high-pitched demand, screaming at her, asking where the money was and why she was looking at him like a corpse. The dam inside Natalie finally broke. A harsh, ugly sob ripped through her chest, and she shoved him away with a sudden, violent burst of energy. She backed into the center of the living room, wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach as if she were in physical pain. "It's gone, Derek," she shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of her own failure. "All of it is gone." Derek froze, his hands hovering in the air. He blinked rapidly, his brain unable to process the words. He stammered that they only needed a small fraction of the startup capital. Natalie laughed, a hysterical, manic sound that chilled the air in the room. "There is no startup capital," she cried out, her voice echoing through the house. "There is no boutique fitness studio. There never was. It was all a lie to get the money out of your accounts. The $1.5 million we kept from the loan shark is gone. I wired it to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and I have been completely locked out. We have absolutely nothing left." The silence that followed was crushing. Derek stood perfectly still, looking like a man who had just been shot in the chest but had not yet realized he was bleeding to death. He shook his head slowly, his voice dropping to a raw, breathless whisper. He asked her who she had wired the money to. Natalie closed her eyes, the final truth spilling out of her because she had no strength left to hide it. "I wired it to Lance," she confessed, her voice trembling. "My fitness instructor. We've been sleeping together for the past year. We planned to take the loan money and run away to Mexico together. He promised me a new life, Derek, but he took the money and abandoned me. He played me for an absolute fool."
The reality struck Derek with a brutal, paralyzing force. The beautiful, ambitious wife he had worshipped, the woman he had thrown his own father out into the freezing rain to please, had been sleeping with a boy half her husband's importance to her. She had manipulated him into draining his life savings. She had pushed him to forge federal documents and steal millions from a violent criminal, all to fund her romantic escape with another man. In that moment, Derek understood that he had destroyed his entire life, his career, and his family, for a woman who had only ever seen him as a gullible, convenient piggy bank. Victor watched the color drain completely from his son's face, replaced an instant later by a deep, dark flush of pure, unadulterated rage. A guttural scream erupted from the bottom of Derek's lungs, a sound of absolute agony and absolute hatred. He spun toward the massive flat-screen television they had proudly mounted on the wall just days earlier, snatched a heavy crystal vase from the coffee table and hurled it with all his strength. The glass shattered against the screen with a deafening crash, sending sparks and shards of black plastic flying across the room. Natalie screamed and cowered in the corner. Derek completely lost his mind. He smashed the heavy wooden chairs against the granite countertops. He swept his arm across the dining table, sending the expensive imported wine bottles crashing to the floor, dark red liquids splashing across the tile like blood. He was violently destroying the very lifestyle he had sold his soul to buy. Victor sat in the quiet of his penthouse and took a slow, satisfying sip of his scotch. He did not feel a single ounce of pity. He watched his son tear his own house apart, knowing perfectly well that the clock was ticking. It was almost 5 o'clock. Vaughn was coming, and the violent debt collector would not care about their broken hearts or their shattered marriage. He cared only about his money, and he would extract his payment tonight. The digital clock on Victor's laptop flipped to exactly 5 o'clock. In the world of legitimate banking, a missed deadline might mean a polite email or a small late fee. But in the dark underworld of black market lending, 5 o'clock was the absolute threshold between a business transaction and a violent collection. Victor leaned back in his chair and imagined the anger boiling over in Vaughn's office. The loan shark had checked his accounts. The $75,000 was not there. Derek and Natalie had officially defaulted, and Vaughn was not a man who granted extensions. He was a predator who demanded immediate satisfaction, and he held a document he believed gave him the absolute right to seize his collateral. Across town, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Vaughn mobilized his collection team. He did not send men in business suits.
He dispatched 3 heavy black sport utility vehicles filled with armed, intimidating thugs. Their primary target was the crown jewel of the collateral, the 5-acre commercial transport warehouse. Vaughn wanted it secured, the locks changed, the premises cleared before midnight. He fully expected his men to roll up to the facility, intimidate a sleepy night watchman, and take total control of the massive logistics hub. He assumed it was still owned by a frail, senile old man who had lost his mind. But when the 3 black vehicles aggressively pulled up to the main gates, they did not find an old padlock and a lonely security booth. They hit an impenetrable fortress. The multinational corporation that had purchased Victor's business 3 weeks earlier did not take chances with multi-million-dollar assets. The old chain-link fence had been completely replaced with towering reinforced steel barriers. Massive floodlights illuminated the entire perimeter, turning the dark evening into bright daylight. As Vaughn's men stepped out of their vehicles carrying crowbars and weapons tucked into their jackets, they were immediately met by a highly trained private security force, elite corporate contractors in tactical gear, holding automatic rifles at the ready, flanked by trained guard dogs. The lead thug, a massive man with a thick neck and a scarred face, stepped forward. He arrogantly waved the forged deed in the air, shouting that they were repossessing the property on behalf of a private lender, and demanded the security detail stand down and open the gates. The captain of the corporate team did not even flinch. Calmly, he informed the thugs that they were trespassing on private, federally protected commercial property owned by a global conglomerate. The thug laughed, pulled a heavy pair of bolt cutters from his trunk, and took a threatening step toward the steel barricades. That was his final mistake. The captain did not waste time arguing with street criminals. He raised his hand, and his men instantly leveled their weapons, the sharp click of safeties disengaging echoing over the roar of the nearby highway. And at that exact moment, the piercing wail of police sirens tore through the evening air. The corporation had wired a silent alarm straight to the local precinct. Within 3 minutes, half a dozen Austin police cruisers swarmed the industrial cul-de-sac, red and blue lights painting the buildings, officers pouring out with weapons drawn, ordering Vaughn's men to the ground. The thugs, realizing they were hopelessly outgunned by both the corporate force and the police, dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The officers confiscated the forged deed and handed it to the corporate lawyers who had already arrived. The lawyers took one look at it, scoffed, and produced the genuine, legally binding transfer documents proving the corporation had bought the property long before that loan was ever signed. The deed Vaughn held was exposed as a worthless piece of trash. The lead thug, now handcuffed in the back of a cruiser, was allowed one phone call. He dialed Vaughn. Victor could only imagine the explosive rage on the other end of that line when the loan shark heard the news. His men hauled off to jail on trespassing and weapons charges. His multi-million-dollar collateral nothing but an illusion locked behind a wall of lawyers and tactical guns. The reality crashed down on Vaughn all at once. He had been completely scammed. He had handed $2 million of his own dirty money to a desperate corporate vice president and received absolutely nothing in return. He was out $2 million, and his reputation in the criminal underworld had been shredded by a man in a silk suit. For a man like Vaughn, the money was almost a smaller wound. In his world, a reputation was the only thing that kept a predator at the top of the food chain. He had built his entire operation on the simple, terrifying certainty that no one stole from him and walked away breathing. And now somewhere out there, people were already whispering, they were laughing. A frail old man and his arrogant son had made the great Vaughn look like an amateur, had used his own greed to lure him into pledging his money against a property that had never been theirs to give. Every hour that story spread, his power bled out a little more. He could not undo the loss, but he could make an example so brutal, so unforgettable that no one would ever dare laugh again.
Vaughn slammed his phone down. His mind pivoted instantly from the lost warehouse to the only assets left on the board, the suburban house, and far more importantly, the man who had dared to steal from him. The target on Derek's back swelled to enormous lethal proportions. Vaughn was no longer interested in collecting a late fee. He was going to collect his stolen money in blood. He gathered his remaining enforcers, his eyes burning with murderous intent, and turned his vehicles toward the suburbs. He was heading straight for Derek. Tonight,
Back in the ruins of the suburban house, the destroyed living room was silent except for the ragged breathing of Derek, standing amid the shattered glass of his own making. The shadows had grown long, and the only light came from the dim glow of the kitchen appliances. Then the sharp ring of Derek's cell phone pierced the quiet, the device vibrating violently against the granite island, the one surface he hadn't managed to smash. Derek froze. He stared at the glowing screen as if it were a venomous snake. He knew exactly who was calling. Natalie whimpered and covered her ears. Derek walked slowly to the counter, his hands shaking so badly he could barely swipe to answer, and brought the phone to his ear. He said nothing, he just listened. Through the kitchen microphone, Victor could clearly hear Vaughn's low, gravelly voice. The loan shark was not shouting. His voice was terrifyingly calm, carrying the cold certainty of a seasoned killer. Vaughn smoothly informed Derek that his men were sitting in a police precinct because of a forged document. He explained in meticulous and chilling detail exactly what he did to people who stole $2 million from his organization. He told Derek he was not going to bother with authorities or collection agencies. He promised in a voice that made even Victor's blood run cold that he was going to drag Derek out of his beautiful home, throw him into the back of a truck, and feed him headfirst into an industrial wood chipper. He ended the call by saying he was only 15 minutes away. The line went dead. Derek dropped the phone. It clattered onto the floor. All the arrogant bluster, all the entitlement that had defined his entire adult life vanished in a single instant. He was no longer an executive. He was prey. He turned to his wife, his eyes wide with primal terror. "We have to go. Right now," he gasped. "He's coming to kill us, Natalie. We have to run." The words broke through Natalie's shock. She scrambled to her feet, her heels crunching on broken glass. But instead of working together, the terror turned them violently against each other. Natalie screamed at him, blaming his stupidity for signing the forged document. Derek screamed back, his face twisted with hatred, cursing her for sleeping with a child and stealing the money that was supposed to save their lives. They stood in the ruins of their home, tearing each other apart while a murderer sped toward their front door. But the ticking clock forced them to move. There was no time to pack their designer luggage. Derek ran into the pantry, ripped a roll of heavy black trash bags from the shelf, threw one at his wife, and kept one for himself. They sprinted up the stairs, stumbling in their desperation. Through the bedroom camera, Victor watched them tear open their custom closets. Derek swept his arm across his dresser, knocking expensive watches into the black plastic bag. Natalie dug through her jewelry box, sobbing, blindly grabbing handfuls of diamond necklaces and gold bracelets and tossing them into the garbage bag alongside crumpled clothes and loose cash. It was a scene of perfect poetic justice. Victor sat perfectly still in the comfort of his penthouse, watching the collapse of their arrogant empire. 3 weeks ago, on a freezing rainy night, they had stood at the top of those exact same stairs and looked down at him with disgust, ordering him to pack his belongings and get out. They had forced an old man into the darkness with nothing but a broken suitcase, and now the universe was forcing them to endure the very same humiliation, magnified 100 times over, fleeing for their lives like cornered rats, stuffing the remnants of their stolen wealth into literal garbage bags. Derek threw his bag over his shoulder, grabbed Natalie by the arm, and dragged her toward the stairs. They burst out into the cool night air, not bothering to lock the door, and ran down the long driveway. Derek hit the unlock button. The Porsche's headlights flashed. They threw the bags into the trunk, jumped in, and the engine roared to life, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. The tires shrieked as Derek backed violently into the street and tore away into the shadows. A moment later, a heavy black SUV crept onto their street from the opposite direction, its headlights cutting through the dark like the eyes of a hungry predator. Vaughn had arrived, but the house was empty. Derek and Natalie were gone, driving blindly into the night with no money, no plan, and a violent criminal hunting them down. Victor slowly closed his laptop, a deep sense of closure washing over him. The trap had snapped shut flawlessly. While Victor slept peacefully in his climate-controlled penthouse, his son and his wife endured a very different kind of night. They drove aimlessly for hours, terrified that every pair of headlights in the mirror belonged to Vaughn's enforcers. Eventually, exhaustion and their empty accounts forced them off the highway, into the cracked, weed-choked parking lot of a dilapidated roadside motel, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour, bathed in the flickering glow of a broken vacancy sign. They paid with the loose cash from their garbage bags. When Derek flipped the light switch, a thick swarm of cockroaches scattered across the stained carpet. Natalie, the woman who had once complained about the thread count of her imported sheets, collapsed onto the lumpy mattress and wept until she had no tears left. They spent 3 days barricaded in that windowless room. The Texas summer heat baked the cinder block walls, but they were too terrified to open the door or run the rattling air conditioner. They lived in constant, paralyzing paranoia. Every time a truck rumbled down the highway or a door slammed nearby, Derek jumped, expecting the flimsy frame to splinter inward and reveal Vaughn with a loaded weapon. Their glamorous facade had melted away, leaving 2 hollow shells surviving on stale vending machine crackers and warm tap water. Derek's silk shirt was stained with grime, his face covered in an unkempt beard. Natalie sat in the corner, clutching a bag of jewelry she could not safely pawn, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. The silence between them was toxic, heavy with the unspoken truth that they had destroyed each other. No credit cards, no working bank accounts, no powerful friends to call. They were marooned on a miserable island of their own creation. But a desperate mind is a dangerous thing. As hunger gnawed at his stomach and the fear of the loan shark drove him toward madness, Derek's mind began frantically searching for an escape hatch. He could not go to the police. Walking into a precinct meant immediate arrest for the federal forgery and wire fraud he had committed. He was boxed in by his own crimes. And as he sat on the edge of the filthy mattress, staring at his trembling hands, a sickeningly familiar thought took root in his twisted mind. He thought about his father. He did not think of Victor with a sudden wave of genuine remorse for throwing him into the rain. He did not feel guilt for trying to steal his life's work. Instead, his corrupted mind reverted to its default setting. He saw his father purely as a resource. He convinced himself that the old man was a sad, confused soul wandering the streets or sitting in some underfunded shelter, desperately waiting for his beloved son to come and rescue him. Derek paced the cramped room, muttering his twisted plan aloud to an unresponsive Natalie. He reasoned that despite his cruelty, his father would still blindly forgive him if he just played the role of the suffering, apologetic son. He knew Victor had driven away without his vintage commercial freight truck, a vehicle now sitting in a long-term storage lot easily worth $50,000 in a quick cash sale. But his ambition did not stop at selling his father's last possession. His voice dropped to a cold, calculating whisper as he laid out the ultimate betrayal. He planned to find the old man, drag him out of whatever shelter he was hiding in, and force him to take out a massive life insurance policy with Derek named as the sole beneficiary. He would take the policy documents to Vaughn, offering his father's impending death as guaranteed collateral to settle the debt. He reasoned that the old man was weak, his heart frail, and the stress of being homeless had probably pushed him to the edge of the grave anyway. It was a level of moral bankruptcy that defied comprehension. He was plotting to monetize his own father's death to save his own miserable life. Energized by this disgusting strategy, Derek dug out a cheap burner phone and began a series of frantic, deceptive calls. He dialed every local hospital, every housing authority, every charity shelter in the greater Austin area. He put on his best performance, crying into the receiver, telling nurses and volunteers that he was desperately searching for his poor senile father who had wandered away from home during a mental health crisis. He painted himself as the frantic, loving caregiver, leaving his contact information with dozens of sympathetic strangers. He truly believed his father was out there in the dirt, broken and defenseless, waiting to be scooped up and sacrificed on the altar of his greed. The calls yielded nothing. Nobody had seen a confused old man matching that description. After 2 agonizing hours of voicemails and sympathetic apologies, Derek hurled the burner phone onto the bed in a rage. The walls of the tiny room were closing in. Every passing minute brought Vaughn one step closer, but Derek was a survivor in the worst sense, a parasite who always found a host. He did not need the sluggish bureaucracy of charities. He needed a professional. During his years as a vice president, Derek had occasionally employed a morally flexible private investigator to run background checks on rival executives, a mercenary who specialized in tracking digital footprints. Derek dialed the number from memory. He spun a tearful story about his poor father suffering a mental break and wandering away from an assisted living facility, and promised a massive retainer fee the moment the old man was recovered, leveraging an authority he no longer possessed. The investigator agreed to run Victor's social security number and recent financial activity through his databases. 30 minutes later, the phone buzzed. Derek snatched it up. The investigator sounded genuinely surprised. He said locating the old man had been remarkably easy because Victor had made no attempt to hide his footprint at all. He had recently activated several new utilities and registered a permanent change of address with the Postal Service. The investigator read off a street name and building number, then abruptly hung up. Derek scribbled the address onto a torn piece of motel stationery, a triumphant smile spreading across his filthy face. He turned to Natalie, his eyes wild with desperate energy. "He's downtown," Derek whispered, trembling with dark excitement. "Grab your things. We're gonna go pick up my father and fix this whole mess tonight. We'll pull him out of the gutter, force him to sign the papers, and save our own lives." They gathered their garbage bags, too terrified to leave even the stolen jewelry behind, and rushed out into the humid evening, throwing the bags into the trunk of the Porsche. Derek shifted into gear and sped onto the highway, the engine roaring as he chased his fabricated salvation. Gripping the wheel, he enthusiastically detailed his horrific plan to his wife, how he would manipulate the old man's confusion, trick him into signing over the title to the freight truck, and drag him to an insurance broker in the morning to finalize the policy. Natalie nodded along, her own desperation blinding her to the depravity of his words. They expected the navigation to guide them toward the gritty industrial outskirts or some rundown boarding house in a forgotten neighborhood, but as they drove deeper into the city, the map did not lead toward the slums. It directed them straight into the affluent, brightly lit financial district. Derek frowned, tapping the screen, certain the system had glitched. The wide, pristine avenues were lined with towering glass skyscrapers and exclusive five-star restaurants. The deeper they drove into the wealthy heart of the city, the more confused and anxious they became. Finally, the automated voice told Derek to turn. The Porsche rolled to a stop, and they stared through the windshield in paralyzing disbelief. The address on the torn stationery did not belong to a shelter or a charity clinic. They were parked directly in front of the grand, sweeping entrance of the most elite, ultra-secure luxury residential high-rise in the entire city. A masterpiece of steel and glass surrounded by manicured landscaping and guarded by a private security team, its entrance lit by soft golden architectural light, it was breathtaking. A smartly dressed valet stepped forward to open Derek's door. He took one look at the sweat-stained clothes and the smell of cheap motel desperation, and his polite smile faltered. Derek sat frozen behind the wheel, his jaw hanging open as he stared up at the towering monolith of wealth. He looked down at the scrap of paper, then back up at the glass facade, and felt sick. Natalie pressed her hands against the window. There was no logical way a penniless old man could be living in a building that catered exclusively to multimillionaires. A terrifying realization began to creep into Derek's mind. He was not the predator hunting a helpless victim. He was a starving rat walking into the jaws of a sleeping lion. The valet took the keys, his eyes lingering with confusion on the black garbage bags crammed into the back seat. Derek ignored him, grabbed Natalie by the wrist, and pulled her through the revolving glass doors. The lobby was a masterpiece of marble and crystal, the air faintly scented with cedar and fresh lilies, a jarring contrast to the filthy motel they had escaped. Derek marched up to the front desk, trying to project the authority he used to wield, but his wrinkled clothes and wild eyes made him look like a madman. "Excuse me," Derek barked, slamming his palm against the marble. "I'm looking for an elderly man named Victor Caldwell. I was given this address, but there must be some mistake. He's my father. He probably works here in maintenance, or maybe he's the night janitor. He has a history of severe confusion, and I need to collect him immediately." The distinguished concierge behind the counter did not flinch at the aggressive tone. He simply typed the name into his secure terminal. A small chime echoed, and immediately the concierge stood up straighter, his demeanor shifting from polite tolerance to rigid, absolute respect. He looked at Derek, his eyes narrowing as he took in the pathetic sight of the sweating man and his terrified wife clutching their trash bags. "You are Mr. Caldwell's son?" the concierge asked, his tone heavy with surprise and skepticism. Derek nodded frantically, demanding the man call down to the basement and bring his father up. The concierge offered a tight, polite smile. "Mr. Caldwell does not work in the maintenance department, sir," he replied smoothly, stepping out from behind the desk. "Please, follow me. I'll escort you to his residence personally." Derek and Natalie exchanged a frantic, confused look, but they followed. The concierge led them away from the public elevators, down a quiet, heavily guarded corridor, to a single solid bronze elevator door. He swiped a black keycard against a hidden reader and pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner. The door slid open with a silent hiss, revealing an interior of dark walnut and brushed brass. He gestured for them to step inside and pressed the single button at the top of the panel, labeled with a gold letter P. "Have a pleasant evening," the concierge said softly, stepping back as the doors glided shut. The elevator shot upward with stomach-dropping speed. Derek and Natalie stood in the enclosed space, the quiet hum of the machinery masking their shallow breathing. Natalie clutched her bag of stolen jewelry against her chest. Derek wiped the sweat from his forehead, still clinging desperately to the belief that his father was a broken old man living in some servants' quarters attached to a wealthy employer's home. He had no idea the elevator was carrying him directly toward his own reckoning. A soft chime signaled their arrival. The bronze doors parted and the enclosed space opened directly into a breathtaking expanse of unimaginable wealth. Derek and Natalie stepped cautiously out, and the visual shock hit them with the force of a brick wall. The ceilings were impossibly high, lit by custom fixtures highlighting expensive modern artwork. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire suite, offering a panoramic view of the glowing Austin skyline. It was a palace, utterly devoid of the damp basement and the poverty they had so maliciously wished upon him. And in the center of this fortress, Victor sat waiting. He was reclined in a custom brown leather armchair, wearing a sharply tailored navy suit that cost more than Derek's abandoned sports car. In his right hand he held a premium hand-rolled cigar, the smoke curling slowly toward the ceiling. On the glass table beside him sat a crystal decanter of aged scotch and 2 glasses. Mitchell Crawford stood stoically at his right side, holding his familiar briefcase, looking down at the 2 intruders with eyes that held no mercy. Victor did not stand. He did not offer a smile or a fatherly embrace. He simply took a long, slow draw from his cigar, blew the smoke out into the quiet room, and fixed his gaze on Derek's terrified face. The reaction was perfect. Derek's jaw dropped, his eyes bulging as his brain rejected the reality in front of him. The garbage bag slipped from his fingers and hit the hardwood with a dull thud. Natalie let out a strangled gasp, taking a weak step backward until her shoulders hit the closed bronze doors. She looked at the tailored suit, the luxurious furniture, the commanding presence of the lawyer, and her mind simply shattered. The last of Derek's arrogance crumbled. His legs gave out and he collapsed onto his knees, burying his face in his trembling hands, and began to sob loudly. It was not the quiet weeping of a man who understood the error of his ways. It was the wailing of a coward caught in a trap he could never escape. He looked up, tears streaming down his filthy cheeks, and began to beg. "Dad, please," Derek cried, his voice cracking. "You have to help me. I'm so sorry for everything. I was desperate. I was under so much pressure. You have all this money, this incredible fortune. You have to save my life. Vaughn is going to kill us tonight. He promised he'd kill me. But you're my father. You can't just let me die." Before Victor could respond, Natalie lunged forward, self-preservation overriding whatever loyalty she had left. She pointed a trembling finger at her own husband. "Don't listen to him, Victor!" She shrieked. It was all his idea. "He's a monster. He forced me into this insane plan. He's the one who wanted the loan. He's the one who wanted to steal your money. I begged him not to do it. I'm innocent in all of this." Victor sat perfectly still, letting their pathetic voices wash over the room. He took one final draw from his cigar, savored it, and carefully crushed the cherry out in the heavy ashtray. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and clasped his hands together. His silence was a suffocating blanket that smothered their frantic screaming. When the room was finally quiet, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out 3 items, tossing them onto the glass table with a sharp clatter. The first was a small silver USB drive. The second was a thick stack of banking documents bound by a metal clip. The third was an official notarized legal folder bearing the crest of the state of Texas. "That drive," Victor began, his voice cold and entirely devoid of warmth, "contains hours of high-definition footage. It contains the exact moment you threw me out of my own house in the freezing rain. It contains the moment you negotiated a black market loan with a violent criminal. But most importantly, it contains the footage of you, Derek, sitting at my dining table, sweating, as you meticulously forged my signature on an outdated power of attorney. I watched you practice my name for an hour. I heard you tell your wife that I was practically dead anyway." Derek recoiled as if struck by lightning, his mouth opening with no sound. Victor shifted his finger to the banking documents. "That is a complete forensic trace of a massive offshore wire transfer," he continued, turning his gaze to Natalie. "It details exactly how you took $1,500,000 of Vaughn's money and sent it to a bank in the Cayman Islands. It outlines the digital footprint of your 25-year-old fitness instructor, Lance. I know about the empty warehouse. I know he abandoned you. You thought you were a master manipulator, Natalie. You're just a foolish woman who got played by a child. Natalie buried her face in her hands, letting out a long, agonized moan. Finally, Victor tapped the legal folder, and this, he said, his voice dropping into a deadly register, is the finalized deed of sale for the 5-acre commercial warehouse. It proves without a shadow of legal doubt that I sold that property to a multinational corporation for $15 million exactly 3 days before you forged my signature. You pledged an asset you did not own. You sent armed thugs to repossess property protected by a corporate army. Your loan shark is now out $2 million. His men are sitting in a federal holding cell, and he knows exactly who is responsible. He sat back and watched the psychological devastation wash over them. One by one, he dismantled every lie they had told. He explained how he had monitored their cameras, listened to their calls, and watched them carelessly burn $500,000 on cars and watches while plotting his own murder for an insurance payout. They were stripped completely bare. There were no more lies to tell, no more fake apologies to offer, and nowhere left to hide. They had built a towering house of cards on their own greed and cruelty, and he had simply flicked the bottom card away. Derek stared at the 3 items as if they were venomous snakes. His chest heaved. He had always been a coward, but seeing his ruin laid out in such undeniable detail finally broke his mind. He crawled forward on his knees, reaching out to grab the fabric of Victor's trousers, looking up with bloodshot eyes. The weeping apology vanished, replaced by the raw, ugly entitlement that had poisoned his whole life. "But I'm your son," Derek screamed, pointing at the folder. "You have $15 million. $2 million is nothing to you. It's spare change for a man in your position. You could write a single check right now, clear this whole debt with bond, and save my life. You're my father. You're supposed to protect me. You can't just sit there in your $4 million penthouse and watch your only child be murdered over money you don't even need." Victor looked down at the man begging at his feet and felt only a profound, icy clarity. There was no anger left. There was no sorrow. He reached down and firmly pried his son's trembling fingers off his trousers, pushing the hands away with quiet, deliberate force. He leaned closer, making sure Derek could see the emptiness in his eyes. 3 weeks ago, Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, unforgiving whisper that echoed through the suite. "You stood at the top of a staircase and told me to get out of my own house. You threw my broken suitcase into the freezing rain and told me I was a useless freeloading drain on your perfect life. You told me to disappear. What you did not know, Derek, was that my estate planning was already finalized. You were meant to inherit $3 million of this fortune. I built that trust specifically for you so you would never have to struggle a single day for the rest of your life. But you couldn't wait. Your greed and your cruelty consumed you." He reached into his breast pocket one final time and pulled out a small white rectangle of cardstock. He held it out and let it drop to the floor in front of Derek's knees, where it landed face up against the hardwood. "Now," Victor said, leaning back into his chair, "the only thing I am leaving you is this." Derek lowered his eyes and reached for the small card with a trembling hand. He squinted at the simple black text printed across the center. It was not a bank draft. It was not a check. It was a standard business card for a free public defender working out of the downtown Austin courthouse. The realization of his total ruin drained the last color from his face, and before he could utter another plea, 3 heavy, authoritative knocks hammered against the bronze elevator doors. Mitchell stepped forward, smoothed his lapels, and pressed the security release. The doors slid open, revealing 4 federal agents in dark tactical windbreakers, the bright yellow letters of the FBI clearly visible across their chests. They stepped into the penthouse with practiced, intimidating efficiency. Derek Caldwell, the lead agent, announced, his voice booming with authority, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and the criminal forgery of legal documents. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Derek did not run. He did not fight. He simply let his arms fall limp at his sides as the agents hauled him to his feet, turned him around, and snapped the cold steel around his wrists. The metallic click echoed with a satisfying finality. As they read him his rights and marched him toward the elevator, Derek turned his head, casting one final desperate look back at his father. Victor did not blink. He did not offer a nod. He simply watched the bronze doors slide shut, sealing his son away in a cage of his own flawless design. Natalie remained frozen against the wall, her breathing shallow. Mitchell walked to the table, picked up the thick banking documents, and handed the folder directly to her. You are legally free to go, Natalie, Mitchell stated, his voice laced with a dark promise. But Vaughn knows exactly who orchestrated the theft of his $2 million. Your husband is sitting safely behind bars where his enforcers cannot reach him. Vaughn is waiting on the streets. I strongly suggest you start running. Natalie let out a terrified sob, dropped her bag of jewelry, and sprinted toward the emergency stairwell, bursting through the heavy door and vanishing into the long descent. And then the penthouse was finally quiet. Victor stood, walked slowly to the glass doors, and stepped out onto the balcony. He took a deep breath of the cool Austin night air, and for the first time in a very long time, he was completely at peace. He had spent 40 years of his life building structures designed to withstand any storm, and in the end, the most important thing he ever rebuilt was not made of brick or steel. It was his own peace of mind. He had lost a son, but he had refused to let cruelty be rewarded, refused to let greed pull him back into the dirt. The foundation was finally solid again, and this time he knew it would never crack. And that is where the story ends. I think about that old man on his balcony, breathing easy for the first time in years. And then I look around at my own little farm, at the dirt under my nails and the tomatoes still warm in the basket, and I'm reminded of that one rule the soil never breaks. You reap exactly what you sow. The people who threw him out planted cruelty, and when the harvest came due, it took everything they had. He planted a lifetime of quiet, patient work, and in the end, it gave him back his peace. So let me leave you with a question. Do you think the old man went too far? Or do you think he gave them exactly the harvest they planted? Tell me down in the comments and tell me where in the world you're listening from. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe and stay with me. Because there's always another story waiting and another morning out here in the garden. I'll see you on the next one.